Hello Guardians, ISO here. In this video, I wanted to talk some more about the Eliksni in the Last City. Because of their unique position as refugees, they encounter harsh challenges on a daily basis. Luckily for now, they're getting the stable foods and unique ether they require to survive. However, that doesn't mean they aren't curious about human food. The following comes from the lore of the weapon, Chromo Rush. The Eliksni awkwardly shouldered its way onto the empty stool at the ramen shop, and rested its 4 elbows on the bar. Maurice looked up over the huge pot of broth, and thinking a titan in one of their ridiculous helmets had arrived for lunch, called out, "Irashaimase?" It wasn't until he absently stepped to the bar that he realized who his customer was. Metal plating covered the creature's forehead and the side of its face, ending in a nozzle that hissed a stream of bluish mist. A haphazard collision of heavy canvas and metallic weave draped over its shoulders. A Vanguard lanyard dangled absurdly from its neck. It was small for an Eliksni, but its angular head still towered above Maurice as it hunched over the bar. 4 blue eyes looked back at him from above a lipless mouth. It opened, revealing rows of thin, sharp teeth. "One item, ramen soup," the Eliksni croaked stiltedly. "Please?" Maurice held his breath, tightening his grip on the pencil, and grinned. He grinned when he was nervous, and this seemed like as good a time as any. The Eliksni grinned back, nodded, and then opened its horrible mouth again. "I smelled it, and the smell was good," it said. Maurice scanned the bar. His other customers sat frozen, their bowls of ramen steaming silently in front of them. He realized his mouth had apparently decided to talk on its own, as if nothing was wrong. He heard himself ask, "How spicy? 0 to 5 stars." The Eliksni had anticipated this question. "Spicy 5 stars," it said, holding up one hand with 3 claws splayed, and another with 2. "May I receive additional dead flesh, please?" "You got it," Maurice said, his even voice betraying none of his tension, and he turned back to the bubbling pot of broth. Muscle memory took over, and he soon found himself placing a steaming bowl of ramen in front of the creature, who clucked cheerfully. Maurice took a half step back. A small crowd was forming in the walkway in front of the restaurant. Some of the customers leaned in as their curiosity overcame their terror. Maurice noted the woman in seat 2 needed more water, but it could wait. The Eliksni raised its arms tentatively, then looked to Maurice again. "What is the protocol?" Maurice found himself unsure of what pair of the Eliksni's eyes to look into, and focused on the ramen instead. "Well, you eat the noodles and pork and egg with..." "Egg," repeated the Eliksni, enjoying the unfamiliar word. "Yeah, egg. You eat all that with the chopsticks, and you get the broth with the spoon." Maurice saw how the Eliksni's claws dwarfed the ceramic spoon. "Or you can just lift a whole bowl and drink it." Maurice mimed lifting a bowl to his lips. The Eliksni nodded. Its claws tapped the metal on its face, and the hissing blue mist ceased. The Eliksni held the chopsticks, tested their weight, and respectfully placed them back on the bar before bringing the bowl to its mouth with its upper arms. Above the ramen bowl, Maurice saw all 4 of the Eliksni's eyes close. A long moment of tension fell over the shop, the silence broken only by the staccato series of hissing slurps. Finally, the Eliksni lowered the empty bowl. It breathed in as the blue mist resumed its thin spray. It looked towards Maurice. "I tasted all of it," it said with deep satisfaction. "I am very thankful." Maurice's grin turned into a tentative smile. "Glad you enjoyed it." The Eliksni stood and held out what looked like a small model of the traveler. It glowed as it floated in the Eliksni's palm. "Compensation," it said. Maurice reached to take the treasure, then drew his hand back. "For new customers, there's no charge," he said. "No compensation. Thank you for coming in." The Eliksni cocked its head, then clucked as the model vanished beneath the folds of its cloak. It smiled at Maurice. "You," it said, then cleared its throat with a rumble. "You are, And the 5 spirited words that followed were replete with hard consonants. In the confused silence that followed, the Eliksni nodded graciously, then walked through the crowd outside and deeper into the city. We know, of course, that this must be the same young Eliksni that Amanda was talking with in the hangar, the Vanguard temporary volunteer. But it seems the small joke that Amanda said led to a large miscommunication when it was taken to heart by the Eliksni. I think there's 2 important things to take away from this lore entry. This lore comes from a weapon, one that's awarded from the standard seasonal activity, but the context, the lore entry that contains the scene with Amanda creating the misconception, is only gained through the Beneath the Endless Night lore book, which is slightly less easy to acquire. Most players will read the ramen shop scene before the hangar scene, which makes the story quite different. I think it paints a good parallel between how easy information and gossip can spread, like the ramen scene, but rarely do people actually put in the work to get to the bottom of things, like earning the hangar scene. The other thing that's important to take away from the scene is the way that the Eliksni is referred to. In the hangar scene, the other important character is Amanda Holliday, so the Eliksni is referred to as he and him. But in the ramen shop, the only other characters are the shopgoers, the other. They're the only perspective we have, so the Eliksni is referred to as an it. There's fear in these people. Not without a passable reason, of course. Most of the news of the Eliksni that reaches city ears labels them as fallen. They've only ever experienced the Eliksni as raiders and pirates that worship strange machine gods. Even Saint told them tales of the nightmares he experienced when he defeated Fallen that tried to kill him and other refugees of humanity, back when the walls of the last city were being constructed. When the protagonist goes back in time and saves Saint during the Season of the Dawn, he has this to say.
"The Fallen cannot be stopped. They do not negotiate. Their bargains are lies. I've watched them burn and pillage whole villages in the Cosmodrome.
Then he chokes on his own discomfort.
I've watched the dregs eat children. They envy us. Their legends say the Traveler chose them before us, and they will kill, they will torture, they will maim to earn their machine god's favor. Another minute, and they would have eaten my ghost. The Fallen are monsters."
Partially, he's right. Some of the fallen Eliksni houses had no mercy for enemies. They took no prisoners. Especially the houses of Rain, Dusk, and Devils. In the Dark Age, when the Eliksni first arrived on Earth, most were in fact vile. They burned villages, killed on sight, and in some instances the most starved of dregs may have turned to the flesh of humans for sustenance. The following comes from the lore of the weapon, Borrowed Time. The Drifter smelled trouble the moment he entered the bar. His first instinct was to turn around and leave, but he noticed the hooded figure standing nervously nearby, conspicuously inconspicuous. Their hooded cloak was pulled low over their face, but they leaned to the side, intent on catching every angry shout from the crowd of locals in the corner. "Tell what's-his-name to take it easy," Drifter grumbled as he walked by. "I'll handle this." "Take it easy," parroted a polite voice from somewhere under the figure's cloak. "I heard him," sighed the figure, but there was relief in his voice. As Drifter pushed into the crowd, he noted who was armed, who was shouting, and who was doing both. Most seemed to fit into that final category. He smiled. History had taught him the quiet ones were always the most dangerous. He reached the center of the tight knot and found 3 Eliksni sitting at a table, trying to ignore the crowd around them. Undaunted, he pushed his way onto the chair arm of the biggest Eliksni like a feral cat. The Eliksni growled, but Drifter tossed Trust into the center of the table with a heavy thud. Drifter turned toward the crowd. "What's got you fine folk all riled up tonight?" "Take it you don't listen to the radio much," someone said, and the crowd laughed. Places I like tend to have bad reception," Drifter replied. "So how about you tell me what I missed?" The group all spoke at once, a cacophony of accusations. "Whoa!" cried the Drifter. "Seems like some of you been spending too much time staring at that fake night." He turned to the Eliksni. "Now, somewhere in this commotion I think I heard shouting of missing equipment. So, I've gotta ask," he said. "You fellas been taking what don't belong to you?" The big Eliksni spoke. His voice was deep and steady.
We had confusions with your people. Where was self-supply, and where was all supply?
He shrugged.
We learned, and we compensated.
Drifter nodded. "Makes sense for settling into a new place. Ain't a soul here who hasn't checked their neighbor's toolshed for spare SMG parts." A voice spoke. "Hey, I'm missing an SMG," but Drifter held up a hand. "And I don't want to hear they caught any blame for the big night. I swear it's like some folks' brains just wilt in the dark. I know Mithrax is working with a vanguard to figure out this whole Vex thing," he said. The Eliksni seemed to relax a bit, but Drifter held up a finger. "I do have one question of my own," he said. "We've been fighting for a long time, your folk and mine, that's no secret. Plenty of blood spilled on both sides over the years. But I heard stories some of you fellas from the old days caught the hunger." The big Eliksni shifted tensely in his seat as the crowd pressed in. Drifter leaned in, his voice gravelly. "Nasty rumor even says you guys chomped on the occasional toddler." The Eliksni pushed his chair back and lunged to his feet as the crowd gasped. Drifter stood his ground, somehow staring down the Eliksni that was a full meter taller than him.
Never you're young,
the Eliksni boomed.
Never.
Drifter nodded. But the rest? The Eliksni looked at the crowd, then brought his massive head close to Drifter. His voice was steady.
We old ones, we who have been fighting since the beginning. Yes, we sometimes took your dead fighters so that we could live. It was war,
he said, and poked at Drifter's chest with a clawed finger.
And you are made of meat.
Drifter smiled. I hear you, brother, he said, and looked at the Eliksni's claws. Hell, you point that thing at me and all I can think about is how good it tastes with garlic butter. Mmm. He leaned towards the looming creature and ran his tongue over his chapped lips. The Eliksni sized up the tiny man, then dropped his shoulders.
But, as I say, that was long ago,
he said.
We are House Light now, and forevermore. We have peace with your people.
Drifter reached up and patted the Eliksni's chest. That's right, he said, and the Eliksni sat down. And though it don't erase the bad old days, he said as he turned to the crowd, that don't mean it's time to bring 'em back. A dissatisfied grumble rose from the crowd. The fight had gone out of them. The Eliksni shrugged.
Mithrax says we are never to eat people again,
he said quietly. Drifter nodded. Yeah, Zavala tells me the same damn thing. The Eliksni burst into a coughing laughter. The Drifter laughed back, picked up his gun from the table, and waved the crowd away as he pulled over an empty seat. Now make room, he said. These fellas were just about to lose at cards. The endless night, the Vex curse that blocks the sun and the stars, has brought two people together. We're more alike than we are different. And every person, whether a member of humanity or Eliksni, was a choice. Some chose to be monsters. Some allowed fear to choose for them. Some are trying to move on from their past, while some never had that past. Fear is, of course, a natural instinct, and while some rule their fear, others allow fear to rule them. The following comes from the lore of the weapon Grid Skipper. He heard something and snapped awake. There it was again, the skittering of clawed feet above him. In a moment he'd grabbed the pulse rifle from near the door and was outside. He saw nothing but the lip of the tar paper roof against the undulating night sky. That didn't mean anything. They could turn invisible. Everyone knew that. They could just be standing there, 1 or 2 or a dozen, staring down at him. He looked for shimmering outlines, but his vision was filled by the swaying grid of the dark purple night. He squinted as a ripple rolled high overhead, and the grid seemed to move closer, like an enormous sheet settling over the city. A wave of pressure pushed down, building in his sinuses. He pressed a hand to his eyes. A deep thrum filled his head, and he heard their claws on the walls all around him, their hissing laughter. He turned towards the street, weapon raised. He felt his heart thudding in his chest and sweat beating on his back. Another noise. Someone pounding on glass behind him. He spun, and one of them was in his house, looking out at him through the window. His sweaty fingers fumbled to turn the safety off as it opened its mouth.
"Dad,"
the fallen shouted.
"you're standing in the garden."
He looked down dumbly. Cherry tomatoes were crushed beneath his bare feet. His son yelled again, no longer a fallen, merely irritated and half asleep. "Come back inside." Hands shaking, he stepped out of the garden. He fought the urge to look into the sky as he walked back to the house. The fear is causing people's eyes to play tricks on them, and it eventually reaches a boiling point, as shown in the lore for the weapon, Shattered Cipher. Helena looked suspiciously at the broken window in the abandoned building and checked her datapad coordinates again. She'd never been to this corner of the city before. "Mom?" she called doubtfully, hearing her voice echo in the empty space. "Back here," answered her mother, and Helena's stomach dropped. She pulled open a rusty door and found her mother in a low concrete room, frantically packing the contents of a long table into duffel bags. Along the far wall, another woman was balling up a plastic tarp. The room smelled like chemicals. A man shouldered a large black bag, pushing his way past her in a cloud of cologne, alcohol, and sour sweat. Helena noticed a small signal jammer blinking orange on the table. Behind it, an exo was waist-deep in a rebar-lined fracture in the floor.
"Tight fit,"
he grunted as he wriggled his way deeper into the gap.
"but I'm guessing he didn't get far. I'll find him."
He vanished into the hole. "What's going on?" Helena asked. "Don't ask questions," her mother said as she shrugged a damp strand of blonde hair out of her face. "We need to get moving." She nodded toward the far corner of the room. "You take that pile." Helena crossed her arms warily. "Mom, what are you doing out here?" "I don't have time to talk about this now," her mother snapped. "You don't know what's going on. You didn't see them looking through the windows. You didn't hear what this one said in the ramen shop." For the first time, her mother looked up. Dangerous intensity burned in her eyes. "They're using the dark to blind us, and we're not gonna let it happen. Now help me." Helena walked slowly to the trash pile in the corner. Towels soaked with blue fluid. Rubbery tubes, strange scraps of metal. A laminated card that read, "Temporary." Her voice was small. "Mama, what did you do?" There's no happy ending to this story. There's no dialogue I can cut away to lessen its impact either. The young Eliksni we met in the hangar was eager for conversation. It's a shame he was met with such cruel company. Thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one.